"Name your price to leave," the Duke said. She smiled. "Your title will do nicely." The carriage wheels struck a rut, and Cordelia Blackwood's forehead connected with the window frame for the third time in as many miles. She pressed her palm against the growing bruise and wondered, not for the first time, whether dignity was truly worth the 4-hour journey from London in a mail coach that smelled distinctly of wet sheep. It was, she decided. It had to be. Outside the rain-streaked window, the Hertfordshire countryside rolled past in watercolour shades of grey and green, the late October sky pressing down like a damp wool blanket. Somewhere ahead, through the mist and drizzle, lay Thornfield Manor seat of the Duke of Thornfield, one of the most powerful men in England, and currently in possession of an 8-year-old daughter who had driven away 7 governesses in 2 years. 7. Cordelia had done her research. Miss Hendricks had lasted 4 months before departing in tears. Mrs. Crawford had managed 6 weeks. The most recent, a stern Scottish woman named Miss Macpherson, who came with impeccable references and a reputation for taming difficult children, had fled after only 9 days, reportedly claiming that Lady Isabel Ashworth was not a child at all, but a changeling sent to torment the righteous. Cordelia smiled despite herself. She rather liked the sound of Lady Isabel. The coach lurched again, and her small valise slid across the seat. She steadied it with one hand, feeling the worn leather beneath her fingers. Everything she owned was in that bag. 3 serviceable dresses, 2 sets of undergarments, her mother's pearl earrings that she would die before selling, and a letter of recommendation so heavily edited it barely resembled the truth. "Miss Blackwood possesses an adequate understanding of French, Italian, and watercolours," Lady Whitmore had written, her pen strokes as cold as her heart. "She is competent with a pianoforte, and may be relied upon to maintain basic order in a schoolroom." What Lady Whitmore had not written: "Miss Blackwood refused to let me beat my son for crying. Miss Blackwood told me that children are people, not ornaments. Miss Blackwood has opinions, which is intolerable in a servant." Cordelia had lasted 3 months in the Whitmore household. 3 months of biting her tongue until it bled, of watching a 6-year-old boy flinch whenever his mother entered the room, of pretending she didn't notice when Lord Whitmore's gaze lingered too long on her figure. In the end, she'd thrown a vase at Lord Whitmore's head when he'd cornered her in the library mist, unfortunately, and Lady Whitmore had dismissed her without a reference. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months of dwindling savings and increasingly desperate applications, of watching her last decent dress grow shiny at the elbows and her boots develop cracks that let in the rain. 4 months of being reminded over and over that Miss Cordelia Blackwood, formerly of Blackwood House in Surrey, daughter of the respected merchant George Blackwood, was now nothing more than another desperate woman seeking employment in a world that had no use for desperate women. But this position, this was different. The Duke of Thornfield was known for paying handsomely, and his estate was far enough from London that gossip would be slow to reach him. More importantly, he had a reputation for caring about nothing except results. He would not care about her father's disgrace or her lack of proper references. He would care only about whether she could manage his impossible daughter. And Cordelia could manage anything. She had to. There was no one else left to manage it for her. The coach crested a hill, and suddenly the mist parted like a curtain being drawn back, and there it was, Thornfield Manor, rising from the landscape like something out of a Gothic novel. Grey stone walls, towering chimneys, windows that caught the weak afternoon light and threw it back like a challenge. The building sprawled across the hilltop, massive and imposing and utterly indifferent to the tiny carriage approaching its gates. Cordelia's stomach tightened. She had grown up comfortable, surrounded by warmth and books and her father's booming laugh. Their home in Surrey had been prosperous but not grand, filled with the chaos of a merchant's life, papers everywhere, visitors at all hours, the smell of her mother's roses drifting through open windows. This was something else entirely. This was old money, old power, old stone that had watched generations of Ashworths live and die and considered them all equally insignificant. "You are not insignificant," she told herself firmly. "You are exactly what that child needs, and you will make them see it." The carriage rattled through the gates and up the long drive, gravel crunching beneath the wheels. By the time they reached the front entrance, Cordelia had composed her face into an expression of serene competence, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She was not nervous. She was never nervous. Nervousness was a luxury she could no longer afford. A footman emerged to open the carriage door, his livery immaculate despite the drizzle. He did not offer his hand to help her down, and she did not expect him to. Governesses occupied a peculiar position in a great house, not quite servant, not quite family, not quite anything at all. She was used to being invisible. Sometimes it was even useful. "Miss Blackwood, for the governess position," she said crisply. "I have an appointment with His Grace." The footman's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "His Grace is occupied. The housekeeper will see you." Of course he was occupied. Dukes were always occupied, especially when dealing with something as insignificant as a governess. Cordelia had expected nothing else. She followed the footman through the massive front doors and into a hall that seemed designed to make visitors feel small. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, portraits of stern Ashworth ancestors glaring down from gilded frames. The air smelled of beeswax and old wood and money, that particular scent of accumulated wealth that Cordelia had learned to recognize during her time in grand houses. A woman emerged from a side door, her grey dress severe, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Mrs. Hartley, Cordelia presumed the housekeeper, whose name had appeared in the correspondence. She looked Cordelia up and down with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. The worn hem of her travelling dress, the carefully mended gloves, the face that was pretty but not beautiful, the posture that refused to apologize for any of it. "Miss Blackwood." It was not a greeting so much as a classification. "You're younger than your letter suggested." "I am 26, Mrs. Hartley. Old enough to have experience, young enough to have patience." Cordelia kept her voice pleasant but firm. First impressions mattered, especially with housekeepers. They could make a governess's life tolerable or miserable, and Mrs. Hartley had the look of a woman who enjoyed choosing miserable. "His Grace will see you in his study. You have 5 minutes." Mrs. Hartley's lips thinned. The last 3 applicants had 5 minutes. None of them lasted past the first. A warning or a challenge, Cordelia couldn't tell. Perhaps both. She followed the housekeeper through a maze of corridors, her boots clicking against the marble, her heart beating just slightly faster than she would have preferred. The study door loomed before her heavy oak, polished to a mirror shine, and Mrs. Hartley opened it without knocking, stepping aside to let Cordelia enter. "Miss Blackwood, Your Grace, for the governess position." The door closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. The study was large, lined with books that looked like they had actually been read, dominated by a massive desk positioned before windows that overlooked the rain-soaked gardens. And behind that desk sat the Duke of Thornfield. Cordelia had heard descriptions of Sebastian Ashworth. Cold, they said, ruthless, handsome in the way of statues, beautiful, but impossible to touch. What she had not expected was the sheer physical presence of the man, the way he seemed to take up more space than his body actually occupied, the way his grey eyes found hers and held them with an intensity that made something in her chest tighten. He was not handsome, she decided. Handsome was too soft a word. His face was all hard angles, sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as his manner, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. His hair was black, silvered at the temples in a way that should have made him look older, but somehow only emphasized the lean vitality of his frame. He wore his clothes like armor, impeccably tailored, not a thread out of place. He did not rise when she entered. He did not greet her. He simply looked at her, his pen still in his hand, as if she were an interruption barely worth acknowledging. "Miss Blackwood." His voice was low, clipped, utterly without warmth. "Your references are thin." "My experience is not." She clasped her hands before her, refusing to fidget. "I have served as governess in 3 households and companion in 1. I am proficient in French, Italian, Latin, geography, history, arithmetic, watercolors, pianoforte, and needlework. I can also teach the basics of astronomy, botany, and chess, should the need arise." One dark eyebrow rose. "Latin? For a girl?" "Lady Isabel will be expected to run a household and manage an estate. Latin is the foundation of legal and medical terminology. It will serve her better than accomplishments designed only to impress potential husbands." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Cordelia realized too late that she had let her opinions show. Most employers did not want opinions. Most employers wanted compliance wrapped in competence. But Sebastian Ashworth was not most employers. Something flickered in his grey eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the first spark of reluctant interest. "You have previous experience with difficult children?" "I have previous experience with children who have not been understood." Cordelia kept her gaze steady on his. "There is a difference." "7 governesses would disagree with you." "7 governesses were not me." Another silence. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She forced herself to stand perfectly still, to meet his assessment without flinching. This was the moment she knew, the moment when he would decide whether she was worth the trouble. "My daughter," he said finally, "is not an easy child. She is stubborn, manipulative, and prone to theatrics. She has driven away every governess I have hired through a combination of tantrums, deception, and sheer force of will. The last one claimed Isabel had tried to set her hair on fire." "Had she?" The Duke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to count. "It was only a candle. Miss Macpherson was dramatic. Then Lady Isabel was simply testing boundaries." Cordelia allowed herself a small smile. "Children test boundaries when they feel unsafe. It is how they discover where the walls are." "You think my daughter feels unsafe?" The question was sharp, edged with something that might have been defensiveness or might have been guilt. Cordelia considered her answer carefully. "I think," she said, "that a child who has lost her mother and who has been through 7 governesses in 2 years is searching for something stable. She does not need discipline. She needs someone who will not leave." The Duke's expression shuttered, closing off whatever emotion had flickered there. He rose from his desk, and Cordelia was struck again by the sheer size of him. Not just tall, but broad, powerful. A man built for command. He moved toward the window, presenting her with his back, and she took the opportunity to breathe. "1 month," he said without turning. "Trial period. £20 per annum if you survive it. You will have Sundays off and full access to the library. Your room will be in the east wing, near the nursery. You will take meals in your quarters unless otherwise instructed." £20 was generous, very generous for a governess. Cordelia's heart leapt, but she kept her voice steady. "Acceptable. When do I meet Lady Isabel?" He turned then, and something in his face made her stomach clench. It was not cruelty, exactly, but there was a warning in his eyes, a challenge. "Now," he said, and crossed to the bell-pull by the door. Within moments the door opened, and Mrs. Hartley appeared, her face carefully blank. Behind her, held firmly by the hand, was a small figure in a white dress. Lady Isabel Ashworth was 8 years old, and clearly furious about it. She had her father's dark hair and sharp features, but her eyes were different, a deep blue that flashed with something between anger and intelligence. Her chin was lifted, her small jaw set, her entire posture radiating defiance. "Lady Isabel," the Duke said, his voice flattening into something cold and formal. "This is Miss Blackwood. She is to be your new governess." Isabel's gaze swept over Cordelia with contempt far too practiced for a child her age. "The last one smelled like cabbage and cried when I put a frog in her bed." "What will make you cry, Miss Blackwood? I'm collecting specimens." Mrs. Hartley's sharp intake of breath suggested this was not the introduction she had hoped for. The Duke's face remained impassive, but Cordelia caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands curled at his sides. She smiled. "That depends on the frog. Was it a common frog or a marsh frog? The common ones are quite dull, but the marsh frogs have the most remarkable call. I collected them myself when I was your age." Isabel blinked. Whatever response she had expected, it was not this. "You collected frogs?" "Frogs, newts, and one particularly aggressive toad named Wellington, who lived in my mother's garden for 3 years. Cordelia crouched down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "He bit my finger once. I still have the scar. Would you like to see?" She extended her hand, palm up, showing the tiny white mark on her index finger. Isabel stared at it, her defiance wavering in the face of unexpected interest. "Toads don't bite," she said, but her voice was uncertain now. "This one did. He was defending his territory. I had accidentally stepped on his favorite moss patch." Cordelia met the child's blue eyes steadily. "I learned something important that day. Sometimes the creatures who seem the most difficult are just protecting something they love." Something flickered in Isabel's face, recognition perhaps, or the first crack in her carefully constructed walls. Then her expression hardened again, and she pulled her hand free from Mrs. Hartley's grip. "Father says you have 1 month. The last governess didn't last 9 days. She lifted her chin. "I wager you won't last a fortnight." "Then we shall have to see who wins that wager." Cordelia rose, keeping her voice light. "I should warn you, though I have never lost a wager in my life." It was a lie, of course. She had lost countless wagers, countless gambles, countless hopes. But Isabel didn't need to know that. Isabel needed someone who would not be moved, who would stand firm no matter how hard she pushed. The Duke cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hartley will show you to your quarters. Dinner is at 8. You will take it in the nursery this evening." His grey eyes met hers for just a moment, unreadable. "Welcome to Thornfield, Miss Blackwood." It was not a welcome. It was a dare. Cordelia smiled, her most serene, most unshakable smile, and followed Mrs. Hartley out of the study. Her room was small but clean, tucked into the east wing of the manor, with a window overlooking the gardens. The furniture was serviceable: a narrow bed, a washstand, a writing desk, a wardrobe large enough to hold her meagre possessions 3 times over. Someone had lit a fire in the grate, and the warmth was so unexpected that Cordelia stood in the doorway for a long moment, just breathing it in. "The nursery is through the connecting door," Mrs. Hartley said, her voice as cold as ever. "Lady Isabel's quarters are beyond. She takes breakfast at 8 and lessons at 9, tea at 4. She is permitted 1 hour of outdoor exercise per day, weather allowing. And when the weather does not allow, she is to remain in the nursery." Mrs. Hartley's lips thinned. "The child is energetic." It is best to keep her contained. Contained, like an animal, like a problem to be managed rather than a child to be nurtured. Cordelia nodded, keeping her thoughts off her face. I understand. Do you? The housekeeper stepped closer, her grey eyes hard. You seem very confident, Miss Blackwood, very sure of yourself for a woman in your position. A woman in your position. Cordelia heard what was not said. A woman without connections, without references, without protection. A woman who could be dismissed at any moment and left with nothing. I am sure of my abilities, she said quietly. Nothing more. Mrs. Hartley held her gaze for a long moment, then stepped back. Dinner will be sent up at 8. I would advise you to rest. Tomorrow will be trying. The door closed behind her, and Cordelia was alone. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The fire crackled. The rain continued to tap against the window. Somewhere in this vast, cold house, a lonely child was planning her next attack, and a cold, closed-off duke was pretending he didn't care about any of it. 1 month, Cordelia told herself. Just survive 1 month, and everything will be different. She unpacked her valise, hanging her 3 dresses in the cavernous wardrobe, setting her mother's pearl earrings on the nightstand where she could see them. Then she washed her face in the basin of cold water, pinned up her copper hair more tightly, and squared her shoulders. Time to meet her enemy. The nursery was everything Cordelia had expected, and nothing she had hoped for. It was a large room, well lit, with windows that would be bright on sunny days. But it felt abandoned somehow, the toys neatly arranged on shelves, the books lined up with military precision, the desk and chair positioned exactly in the center of the room, as if for a formal portrait. There was no chaos here, no evidence of a child's life being lived. Isabel stood by the window, her small figure silhouetted against the grey afternoon light. She did not turn when Cordelia entered. The door does not lock from the outside, she said. I checked. You cannot trap me in here. I have no intention of trapping you anywhere. Cordelia moved to the center of the room, positioning herself where Isabel could see her without turning. This is your space? I am merely a guest in it. You are not a guest. You are an employee. The child's voice was precise, cutting. Employees can be dismissed. They can. Cordelia settled into the chair by the desk, making herself comfortable. So can dukes, technically. It just requires more paperwork. Isabel turned then, her blue eyes narrowed. Dukes cannot be dismissed. They are born to their positions. True, but there have been dukes throughout history who have lost their titles for treason, for madness, for marrying the wrong person. Cordelia smiled slightly. No position is truly secure, Lady Isabel. Not even a duke's. Certainly not a governess's. The child considered this, her small face thoughtful. She was clever, Cordelia realized, far cleverer than most adults gave her credit for. The tantrums and the frogs and the candle incidents were not the actions of an out-of-control child. They were strategies, carefully calculated to achieve a specific goal. The question was, what was that goal? What do you want? Isabel asked suddenly. The other governesses wanted different things. Miss Hendricks wanted me to love her. Mrs. Crawford wanted me to be quiet. Miss Macpherson wanted me to be afraid. Her chin lifted. What do you want? Cordelia considered the question seriously. It deserved a serious answer. I want you to learn, she said finally, not because it will make you a better prospect for marriage, or because it will please your father, or because it is expected. I want you to learn because there is a whole world out there full of remarkable things, and you deserve to know about them. Isabel was silent for a long moment. Then, Miss Hendricks said something like that once, but she didn't mean it. How do you know? because when I asked her about the stars, she said ladies don't need to understand astronomy. The child's voice was flat, reciting a familiar disappointment. When I asked about history, she said I should focus on needlework. When I asked about death, she cried. Death. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. What did you ask about death? Cordelia kept her voice gentle. Isabel turned back to the window. When she spoke, her voice was small and tight, and entirely unlike the sharp-edged child who had challenged Cordelia downstairs. I asked if my mother knew she was going to die. If she knew, and had me anyway. A pause. Miss Hendricks said it was inappropriate to discuss. Then she cried. Then she asked Father to dismiss me. To dismiss you? She said I was unnatural, that normal children don't ask such questions. Isabel's shoulders were rigid, her small hands clenched at her sides. I heard her telling Mrs. Hartley. She said I was disturbed, that there was something wrong with me. Cordelia rose from the chair and crossed to the window, standing beside the child but not touching her. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds, painting the gardens in shades of grey and gold. There is nothing wrong with you, she said quietly. Those are exactly the right questions to ask. They are just very hard questions, and most adults don't know how to answer them. Do you know how to answer them? I don't know if your mother knew she was going to die. I suspect she knew there was a risk. There is always a risk with childbirth. But I think... Cordelia paused, choosing her words carefully. I think she looked at that risk and decided you were worth it. I think she wanted you so much that she was willing to be brave. Isabel said nothing. Her reflection in the window glass was small and still and achingly vulnerable. My mother died too, Cordelia continued softly. When I was 12, she was ill for a long time before a wasting sickness that the doctors couldn't name. I used to ask her if she was going to die, and she always said she didn't know. Did she know? I think she did. But I think she didn't want to waste her time being afraid. Cordelia watched the child's reflection. She used to tell me that the people we love never really leave us. They stay with us in the things they taught us, the words they said, the way they made us feel. Your mother is still here, Isabel. Every time you are brave, every time you are curious, every time you refuse to be what other people expect you to be, that's her. Isabel's shoulders began to shake. She made no sound, but Cordelia could see the tears sliding down her cheeks in the reflection, could see the way her small body trembled with the effort of keeping silent. She did not touch the child. Not yet. It was too soon for that. You don't have to be strong all the time, Cordelia said. Not with me. You can ask any question you want, feel any feeling you need to feel. That's what I'm here for. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Isabel's ragged breathing and the distant call of birds in the garden. Then, slowly the child turned. You won't last, she whispered. They never do. Then I suppose you'll have to wait and see. Cordelia smiled gently. In the meantime, shall we begin with astronomy? I have always found that the stars help put things in perspective. Isabel stared at her for a long moment, her blue eyes red-rimmed and searching. Then she nodded once, and something in Cordelia's chest loosened. It was not trust, not yet. But it was a beginning. The days that followed were a battlefield of small skirmishes and careful victories. Isabel tested Cordelia constantly, hiding her lesson books, refusing to eat breakfast, filling her bed with spiders, which Cordelia calmly relocated to the garden, remarking that the orb weavers would be much happier outdoors where they could build proper webs. She was rude to Mrs. Hartley in Cordelia's presence, clearly hoping to provoke a reaction. She asked increasingly shocking questions about death, disease, and the various ways people could meet unpleasant ends, watching Cordelia's face carefully for signs of distress. Cordelia answered every question honestly. She responded to every provocation with calm good humor. She did not yell, did not cry, did not threaten or punish or withdraw. She simply remained steady as stone, immovable as the manor itself. And slowly, imperceptibly, something began to shift. By the third day, Isabel stopped hiding her books. By the fifth, she asked grudgingly if Cordelia knew any more stories about Wellington the aggressive toad. By the seventh, she laughed at one of Cordelia's jokes and then looked horrified at herself, as if laughter were a betrayal. They studied astronomy together, tracing the constellations on star charts and discussing the myths behind them. They read history, not the dry recitations of kings and battles that Miss Hendricks had favored, but stories of remarkable women who had defied expectations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Boudicca, the scientist Mary Somerville. Isabel was particularly fascinated by Boudicca, the warrior queen who had led a rebellion against Rome. She lost, though, Isabel said one afternoon, frowning at the illustration in their book. The Romans won in the end. They won the battle, Cordelia agreed, but Boudicca's story survived for almost 2,000 years. She inspired generations of people to stand up for what they believed in. That's a different kind of victory. Isabel considered this. Father says winning is the only thing that matters. Your father says a great many things. Cordelia kept her voice neutral. But I notice he has a library full of books about people who lost battles but won history. Perhaps he is not as certain as he pretends to be. The child's eyes widened slightly at this, but she said nothing more. The seed, however, had been planted. The Duke himself remained a distant presence, a shadow Cordelia glimpsed. Occasionally in hallways, a voice she heard giving orders to servants, a figure she watched from the nursery window as he rode out on a black stallion, his back straight, his face unreadable. He did not summon her for progress reports. He did not inquire about his daughter's studies. He did not, as far as Cordelia could tell, acknowledge her existence at all. It should not have bothered her. She was the governess. He was the employer. Their interaction need not extend beyond her wages and her duties. And yet, she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, the controlled power of his movements, the flicker of something human she had seen in his eyes when he spoke of his daughter, the way his voice had dropped when he mentioned the governesses who had fled. There was pain there, beneath the cold surface. Pain and guilt, and something else she couldn't name. He blames himself, she thought one evening, watching him walk alone through the gardens below her window, his shoulders bowed against some invisible weight. For his wife's death, for his daughter's unhappiness, for all of it. It was not her concern. She had enough troubles of her own without adding the demons of a damaged duke to the list. And yet, watching him disappear into the gathering darkness, she felt something twist in her chest that was not quite pity and not quite attraction and not quite anything she could put a name to. Dangerous, she told herself firmly, turning away from the window. Dangerous and foolish and entirely beside the point. She had a child to save. That was all that mattered. It was on the 9th day that everything changed. Cordelia woke to the sound of coughing, harsh, rattling coughs that echoed through the connecting door between her room and the nursery. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, throwing on her wrapper and rushing through to find Isabel curled in her bed, her small body shaking, her face flushed an alarming red. Isabel. Cordelia pressed her hand to the child's forehead and felt her heart stop. Burning. The child was burning with fever. Isabel, can you hear me? The blue eyes that opened were glazed, unfocused. Mamma, the child whispered. Mamma, is that you? Oh God, oh God. Cordelia's mind raced through every illness she knew: influenza, scarlet fever, the 100 nameless agues that claimed children's lives in their sleep. She needed a doctor. She needed cool water and clean cloths and someone who knew what they were doing. She needed help. "Stay here," she said, knowing it was foolish. Where would the child go? But needing to say something. "I'm going to get help. I'll be right back." She ran through the dark corridors of Thornfield Manor in her nightclothes, her bare feet slapping against the cold marble, her heart pounding in her ears. Mrs. Hartley's room. Where was Mrs. Hartley's room? She didn't know. She didn't know anything except that Isabel was sick, and she needed a doctor, and the child had called her Mama, and she collided with something solid and warm in the darkness, and strong hands caught her arms to keep her from falling. "Miss Blackwood!" The Duke's voice, rough with sleep and sharp with alarm. "What the devil? Isabel!" The word came out as a gasp. "She's sick. High fever. She needs a doctor. She needs—" She didn't finish the sentence. The Duke was already moving, striding past her toward the nursery, his long legs eating up the distance. Cordelia ran to keep up, her wrapper streaming behind her. When they reached the nursery, the Duke stopped in the doorway, his face going pale in the candlelight. His daughter lay curled in her bed, smaller than ever, her breath coming in harsh gasps. She was crying now, calling for her mother in a high, thin voice that cut through Cordelia like a blade. "Catherine," Isabel sobbed. "Mama, where are you? Why did you leave me?" The Duke made a sound like a man who had been struck. He crossed to his daughter's bedside in 2 strides, gathering her burning body into his arms, pressing his lips to her damp forehead. "I'm here," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm here, Isabel. Father's here. Want Mama?" The child's fingers clutched weakly at his nightshirt. "Want Mama? Why doesn't she come?" Cordelia was already moving, pulling back the curtains to let in the grey dawn light, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin, soaking cloths to press against Isabel's feverish skin. Behind her, she heard the Duke calling for servants, his voice commanding even in crisis. Mrs. Hartley appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and vanished to summon the doctor. The next hours blurred together like watercolors left in the rain. The doctor came a portly man with kind eyes, who examined Isabel with gentle hands and pronounced it a severe chill that had settled in her chest. Not consumption, not scarlet fever, just a bad cold that had turned dangerous because the child had been running about in the rain the day before and no one had noticed. No one except Cordelia, who had noticed, who had made sure Isabel changed into dry clothes and drank warm milk before bed, who had done everything right and still found herself here, watching a child she had come to care for, fight for breath. "She needs rest," the doctor said, packing away his instruments. "Cool compresses, liquids, and someone to watch over her through the night. The fever should break by morning if all goes well." "And if it doesn't?" The Duke's voice was raw. "Then we shall discuss other options." The doctor's tone was gentle but honest. "But I have every hope, Your Grace. She is a strong child." A strong child. Yes. Isabel was strong. Strong enough to fight 7 governesses. Strong enough to build walls around her heart. Strong enough to survive the loss of her mother. But even strong children could break. The Duke stood by his daughter's bedside as the doctor left, his face carved from stone, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked, Cordelia thought, like a man who had been to hell before and recognized the landscape. "You may go," he said, without looking at her. "I will watch over her." "Your Grace, I said go." His voice was a whip crack in the quiet room. "You have done enough." This is not your concern. Not her concern. The child who had begun to trust her, who had laughed at her jokes and asked about the stars and whispered questions about death, not her concern. Something hot and fierce rose in Cordelia's chest. She stepped forward, placing herself directly in his line of sight. "With respect, Your Grace, I am not leaving." His grey eyes snapped to hers, blazing with anger and fear and something else she couldn't name. "I beg your pardon?" "Isabel needs consistency. She needs to know that the people who care for her will not abandon her when things become difficult." Cordelia held his gaze steadily. "I do not know what happened to the 7 governesses before me, but I suspect at least some of them left because they could not bear the hard parts. I am not them. I am staying. You are the governess. You do not give orders in this house." "I am the governess," she agreed, "which means that child's welfare is my responsibility, and I will not abandon her now, not when she needs me most." The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Outside, the sun was rising, painting the windows in shades of gold and rose. Inside, a child burned with fever, and 2 adults faced each other across a battlefield neither of them had expected. Finally, the Duke looked away. His shoulders slumped just slightly, but enough for Cordelia to see the exhaustion beneath the anger. "Very well," he said quietly. "Stay if you must, but do not get in my way." "I wouldn't dream of it." Cordelia was already moving to Isabel's bedside, lifting the cloth from the basin to press against the child's forehead. "Why don't you rest, Your Grace? I will call you if anything changes." "I am not leaving my daughter." "Then sit." She nodded toward the chair by the window. "You will be no use to her if you collapse from exhaustion." For a moment she thought he would argue. Then, with a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob, he sank into the chair and dropped his head into his hands. The night that followed was the longest of Cordelia's life. She and the Duke took turns at Isabel's bedside, one cooling her forehead with compresses, while the other rested in the chair by the window. They did not speak except when necessary. They did not look at each other except when handing off the cloth or the cup of water. But there was a strange intimacy in the silence, a shared vigil that required no words. Isabel drifted in and out of consciousness, calling sometimes for her mother, sometimes for her father, once heartbreakingly for "Miss Blackwood, please don't go." Cordelia held her hand through all of it, murmuring reassurances, singing half-remembered lullabies from her own childhood. She caught the Duke watching her once, his grey eyes unreadable in the dim light. She did not know what he saw, but he looked away quickly, as if caught at something shameful. The fever peaked near midnight. Isabel's skin burned like fire, her small body trembling, her breath coming in harsh gasps. Cordelia prayed something she had not done since her mother's funeral, begging whatever power might be listening to spare this child. And then, near dawn, something shifted. The trembling stopped. The breathing eased. When Cordelia pressed her hand to Isabel's forehead, she felt the fever beginning to break at last. "She's cooling," she whispered, not trusting her voice to go louder. "She's going to be all right." The Duke was at her side in an instant, his hand brushing his daughter's cheek, his eyes searching her face for signs of recovery. What he saw there made him close his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with tears he did not shed. "Thank God," he breathed. "Thank God." Isabel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were clear now, no longer glazed with fever. She looked at her father, then at Cordelia, confusion giving way to recognition. "You're both here," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "You're both still here." "Of course we are." Cordelia smoothed the damp hair back from the child's forehead. "Where else would we be?" Isabel's hand found hers and held on with surprising strength. Her other hand reached for her father, who took it gently, as if afraid she might break. "Don't leave," Isabel whispered. "Promise you won't leave." "I promise," Cordelia said. The Duke said nothing, but his hand tightened on his daughter's, and something in his face cracked open a wall coming down, a fortress beginning to crumble. They stayed that way as the sun rose over Thornfield Manor, father and daughter and governess, bound together by a night of fear and hope and the first fragile threads of something that might, against all odds, become love. 3 hours later, Isabel was sleeping peacefully, her fever fully broken, her color returning to normal. The doctor had come and gone, pronouncing her out of danger and prescribing rest and beef broth and no lessons for at least a week. Mrs. Hartley had taken over the vigil, her stern face softened by something that might have been relief. Cordelia sat in her own room, too exhausted to sleep, staring at the morning light streaming through her window. She had not changed out of her night clothes. She had not brushed her hair. She had not done anything except sit and breathe and try to process the long, terrible, miraculous night. She was still sitting there when the knock came at her door. "Come in." The Duke entered. He had changed clothes. She saw with distant surprise that he was dressed immaculately, every line perfect, as if the night had never happened. But his face told a different story. There were shadows under his grey eyes, a tension in his jaw that spoke of emotion, barely contained. "Miss Blackwood." His voice was stiff, formal. "I came to speak with you." Cordelia rose, suddenly conscious of her state of undress. Her wrapper was thin, her hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare on the cold floor. It was entirely improper, and she could not bring herself to care. "Of course, Your Grace." He moved to the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. The posture reminded her of their first meeting, when he had dismissed her with cold efficiency and made clear that she was nothing more than another transaction. "You stayed," he said, "through the night, when I told you to go." "I did." "That was insubordinate." "Yes." He turned, and the look on his face made her breath catch. It was not anger. It was not cold distance. It was something raw and complicated and entirely human. "You could have left," he said. "Any other governess would have. When things became difficult, when Isabel was sick and frightening and calling for her dead mother, you could have left." "I could have," Cordelia agreed. "I chose not to." "Why?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Cordelia considered her answer carefully. "Because that child has been abandoned by everyone who should have protected her," she said finally. "Her mother died. Her father withdrew. The people who were supposed to care for her fled the moment things became hard. She has learned at 8 years old that love is temporary and people cannot be trusted." She met his grey eyes steadily. "I will not be another lesson in that cruel curriculum." Something shifted in his face. The crack she had seen by Isabel's bedside widened, deepened, became a chasm. "You presume to judge me." His voice was soft, dangerous. "You presume to know what I have suffered. What I have... I presume nothing." Cordelia cut him off, her own voice sharp. "I see a child who is desperate for her father's attention, and a man who is so consumed by his own guilt that he cannot give it. That is not judgment, Your Grace. That is observation." The silence that followed was absolute. Cordelia's heart hammered in her chest. She had gone too far. She knew she had gone too far. but she could not find it in herself to regret it. Finally the Duke spoke. His voice was cold again, but different somehow, brittle. "Name your price." Cordelia blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "To leave. Name your price. I will pay whatever you ask, a year's wages, 2 years, references, that will open any door in England. Name your price to leave, Miss Blackwood, and I will pay it." She stared at him. He stood rigid by the window, his jaw set, his eyes flat. He looked like a man bracing for a blow, preparing for the moment when she would take the money and go, confirming everything he had ever believed about the transactional nature of human connection. And in that moment, Cordelia understood. He was not trying to dismiss her. He was trying to test her. He was waiting for her to prove that she was like everyone else, that she could be bought, that her care had a price, that nothing in this world was given freely. He was waiting for her to abandon him too. Cordelia smiled. It was not a kind smile or a gentle one. It was the smile of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had grown very tired of it. "Your title will do nicely," she said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. The Duke's face went blank with shock. "I beg your pardon?" "You asked my price. I've given it." Cordelia tilted her chin up, meeting his incredulous stare. "Your title, Your Grace. That is what I want." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." She took a step toward him, then another, closing the distance between them, until she was near enough to see the gold flecks in his grey eyes, the way his pulse beat in his throat. "You think you can buy your way out of connection. You think that if you pay enough, offer enough, throw enough money at a problem, it will go away. But I am not a problem to be solved, Your Grace, and your daughter is not a duty to be discharged." "You don't know what you're saying." His voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "You don't know." "I know that you have built walls so high you cannot see over them. I know that you have convinced yourself that love is a transaction because transactions can be controlled and love cannot." She was trembling now, but she did not step back. "I know that somewhere inside that cold, guarded heart of yours is a man who sat by his daughter's bedside all night and wept when her fever broke. That is the man I am speaking to, not the Duke of Thornfield, not the man who calculates everything in pounds and pence, the man beneath." His hand came up. She thought he might push her away, but instead it hovered near her face, not quite touching, as if he were afraid she might shatter. "You are impertinent," he said hoarsely. "Frequently. And impossible. Often. And I—" He stopped. His hand dropped. His face closed like a door slamming shut. "You should rest, Miss Blackwood. It has been a long night." He stepped around her, heading for the door, and Cordelia let him go. She had said enough, perhaps too much. But at the threshold he paused. Without turning around, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for staying." Then he was gone, and Cordelia was alone with the morning light and the echo of words that had changed everything. The days following Isabel's recovery passed in a strange suspension, as if the household itself were holding its breath. Cordelia threw herself into her duties with renewed determination, filling the nursery hours with lessons on astronomy and history and the proper conjugation of French verbs. Isabel, weakened but recovering, proved a surprisingly eager student, as if the brush with mortality had burned away some of her resistance, leaving behind a child hungry for connection. But it was the Duke who haunted Cordelia's thoughts. She saw him everywhere now, or rather, she noticed him everywhere. the tall figure striding across the grounds at dawn, the shadow passing her door at night, the presence she felt watching from windows as she walked Isabel through the gardens. He did not speak to her beyond the barest necessities. He did not summon her for reports on his daughter's progress. He certainly did not reference the extraordinary conversation in her bedroom, the words that had hung between them like sparks waiting to catch fire. Your title will do nicely. What had she been thinking? Cordelia asked herself the question a dozen times a day, cringing at her own audacity. She had all but proposed to a duke who employed her, who could dismiss her with a word, who held her entire future in his aristocratic hands. It was madness. It was career suicide. It was the most reckless thing she had ever done, and she had once thrown a vase at a viscount's head. And yet, she could not regret it. When she closed her eyes at night, she saw the look on his face in that moment, the shock, the vulnerability, the crack in the armor he wore so carefully. She had reached him. For just an instant, she had seen the man beneath the duke, and that man had been worth reaching. Not that it mattered. He had retreated behind his walls, higher and thicker than before, and she was left to navigate the strange new landscape of Thornfield Manor alone. Miss Blackwood? Cordelia looked up from the star chart she was annotating to find Isabel watching her with an expression of unusual thoughtfulness. They were in the nursery, the afternoon light slanting golden through the windows, a pot of chocolate cooling between them. Yes, Isabel? Why did you become a governess? The question was unexpected. Isabel had asked many things over the past weeks about death and stars and warrior queens, but never about Cordelia herself. It was, Cordelia realized, a sign of trust, a willingness to see her as a person rather than merely a function. I became a governess because I needed to earn my living, she said carefully. My father died and our fortune was lost. I had to find a way to support myself. But you're a lady. Isabel's brow furrowed. Ladies don't work. Some ladies do. The ones without fathers or husbands or fortunes, we work, or we starve. Cordelia kept her voice matter-of-fact. There was no point in wrapping the truth in pretty paper. Isabel would see through it immediately. I was fortunate. I had an education, which meant I could teach. Many women in my position have far fewer options. Isabel absorbed this information, her small face solemn. Is that why you won't leave? Because you need the money? Partly. Cordelia set down her pen. But not entirely. I stay because I want to, because you are worth staying for. Something flickered in the child's blue eyes, hope, perhaps, or the first stirrings of belief. Then her expression shuttered, protecting itself. Father says everyone has a price. He says if you know what someone wants, you can control them. Your father, Cordelia said quietly, has been hurt very badly by people who wanted things from him. It has made him suspicious of everyone's motives, including his own. What do you want from him? The question caught Cordelia off guard. She opened her mouth to deflect, to change the subject, to say something appropriately governess-like about the impropriety of discussing one's employer. But Isabel was watching her with those sharp, knowing eyes, and she found she could not lie. I want him to be happy, she said. I want him to stop punishing himself for things that were not his fault. I want him to see how much you need him, not his money or his title, but him. She paused. And I want him to stop being afraid. Afraid of what? Of loving someone, of being loved. Cordelia smiled sadly. Your father thinks that if he keeps everyone at a distance, he cannot be hurt again. But the distance is hurting him too. It's hurting both of you. Isabel was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a small voice, he used to read to me. Before Mamma died. He would come to the nursery every night and read me stories about knights and dragons and princesses who saved themselves. Her eyes glistened. He stopped after she died. He said he was too busy. He wasn't too busy. Cordelia reached across the table and took the child's hand. He was too sad, and he didn't know how to be sad in front of you, so he stayed away. That's stupid. Yes, it is. Cordelia squeezed her fingers. Grown-ups are often stupid about feelings. We think that if we hide them, they'll go away. But they don't go away. They just get bigger and heavier until we can't carry them anymore. Isabel looked down at their joined hands. Will you help him? Help him be less stupid? I don't know if I can. That's something he has to choose for himself. Cordelia paused. But I can help you. And maybe, if he sees how much better things can be, he'll find the courage to choose differently. The child nodded slowly. Then, with the mercurial shift that only children could manage, she pulled her hand free and reached for the star chart. You've made a mistake, she said, pointing at the constellation Cordelia had been annotating. That's not Cassiopeia. That's Cepheus. Cassiopeia is the one that looks like a W. Cordelia looked at the chart and laughed. You're absolutely right. I must have been distracted. By father? The question was innocent, curious, entirely without guile. Cordelia felt her cheeks warm. By many things, she said diplomatically. Now shall we continue with the lesson, or would you prefer to correct all my other mistakes? Isabel grinned a real grin, bright and mischievous, and Cordelia felt something ease in her chest. Whatever happened with the Duke, whatever walls he chose to build or tear down, she had this. She had a child who was beginning to trust, to laugh, to believe that she was worth loving. It would have to be enough. But it was not enough, not nearly. The truth of this became clear a week later, when Mrs. Hartley summoned Cordelia to her office with a summons that brooked no argument. The housekeeper's quarters were as severe as the woman herself. Dark furniture, minimal decoration, an air of judgment that permeated every surface. Close the door, Miss Blackwood. Cordelia obeyed, her stomach tightening. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the cold satisfaction that radiated from Mrs. Hartley like heat from a banked fire. I have been making inquiries. The housekeeper folded her hands on her desk, her eyes glittering. About your background, your references. Cordelia's heart began to pound, but she kept her face calm. I provided references when I applied for the position. Yes, a letter from Lady Whitmore, who speaks of your adequate qualifications and competent manner. Mrs. Hartley's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. What Lady Whitmore did not mention, what your letter carefully omits, is the reason for your departure from her household. I left by mutual agreement. You were dismissed for assaulting Lord Whitmore. The words fell into the silence like stones into a frozen pond. Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face. That is not... I have spoken with Lady Whitmore's housekeeper, a woman of impeccable reputation, who was happy to share the details of your incident. Mrs. Hartley leaned forward. You threw a vase at a viscount, Miss Blackwood. You attacked a peer of the realm in his own home. He cornered me in the library. He put his hands on me without permission. I defended myself. That is not how Lady Whitmore tells it. Lady Whitmore was not there. No, but her word carries weight. Her husband's word carries weight. Mrs. Hartley's voice sharpened. And your word, Miss Blackwood, the word of a disgraced governess, the daughter of a failed merchant, carries nothing at all. Cordelia's hands clenched at her sides. She knew what was coming. She had always known it would come eventually, had dreaded this moment since the day she first entered Thornfield Manor with her worn valise and her desperate hope. "What do you want?" "I want you gone." Mrs. Hartley's pretense of civility dropped away, revealing the naked hostility beneath. "You do not belong here. You come into this house with your airs and your opinions, upsetting the order of things, filling Lady Isabel's head with ideas above her station. The child was difficult before, but manageable. Now she asks questions, challenges authority, believes she has the right to an opinion. She is 8 years old. Of course she has opinions. She is the daughter of a duke, and she should behave accordingly." Mrs. Hartley rose, her tall frame casting a shadow across the desk. "I have served this family for 20 years. I watched the Duke grow from a boy into a man. I watched him marry, watched him bury his wife, watched him close himself off from the world, and I will not stand by while some jumped-up merchant's daughter destroys everything I have worked to build." "I am not trying to destroy anything. You are trying to worm your way into his affections. Do not think I haven't noticed. The way you look at him, the way you speak of him to the child, you see an opportunity, and you are grasping for it with both hands. That is not true. Then you will have no objection to leaving." Mrs. Hartley smiled, and there was triumph in it. "I am giving you a choice, Miss Blackwood. Leave Thornfield tonight, quietly, without fuss, and I will not share what I have learned with his grace. Your reputation will remain intact, such as it is. You can find another position, another household, another chance." "And if I refuse?" "Then I will tell his grace everything. The vase, the Viscount, the real reason you have moved from household to household, never staying more than a few months." Mrs. Hartley's voice dropped to a purr. "I will tell him what manner of woman he has allowed near his daughter, and then you will leave anyway, but without a reference, without a penny, without any hope of respectable employment ever again." Cordelia stood very still. Her mind raced through options, possibilities, escape routes that did not exist. Mrs. Hartley was right. Her word meant nothing. She was a governess, a servant, a woman without protection or power. If the housekeeper chose to destroy her, there was nothing Cordelia could do to stop it. But there was Isabel. Isabel, who had finally begun to trust. Isabel, who had asked Cordelia to help her father be less stupid. Isabel, who would wake tomorrow to find yet another governess gone, yet another person who had promised to stay and then vanished without warning. Cordelia could not do that to her. She would not. "No." The word came out steady, stronger than she felt. Mrs. Hartley's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. I will not leave." Cordelia lifted her chin. "Tell his grace whatever you wish. Tell him about the vase, the Viscount, every rumour and whisper you have managed to collect. But I am not leaving that child. You are making a mistake." "Perhaps, but it is my mistake to make." For a long moment they stared at each other, two women on opposite sides of a battle that had nothing and everything to do with a lonely child and a broken duke. Then Mrs. Hartley's face hardened. "Very well. You have chosen your path, Miss Blackwood. Do not say I did not warn you." She swept past Cordelia and out of the room, her skirts rustling with furious purpose. Cordelia remained standing, her heart pounding, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. What had she done? She had 3 hours to prepare herself, 3 hours of teaching Isabel French vocabulary, while her mind raced through explanations, defences, arguments she might offer when the Duke inevitably summoned her. 3 hours of pretending that everything was normal, while her entire future hung by the thinnest of threads. When the summons came, she was almost relieved. "His Grace wishes to see you in the library." The footman's voice was carefully neutral, but Cordelia caught the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Word had spread then. The household knew something was happening, even if they didn't know what. She followed him through the familiar corridors, her footsteps echoing against the marble, her spine held deliberately straight. The library doors loomed before her, the same doors she had passed 100 times, and then the footman was opening them, and she was stepping through into the warm, book-scented dimness. The Duke stood by the fireplace, his back to her, his posture rigid. He did not turn when she entered. "Close the door." She obeyed. The click of the latch seemed very loud in the silence. "Mrs. Hartley has made some concerning allegations." His voice was flat, controlled. "She claims you were dismissed from your previous position for violence against your employer. She claims your references are fraudulent. She claims—" He paused. "She claims many things. Some of them are true." Now he turned. His face was the cold mask she remembered from their first meeting, all sharp angles and guarded eyes, betraying nothing. "Which ones?" "I did throw a vase at Lord Whitmore. I missed, unfortunately." Cordelia kept her voice steady. "He cornered me in his library late one evening and attempted to force himself upon me. When I resisted, he threatened to have me dismissed without a reference, so I threw the vase and ran." Something flickered in the Duke's grey eyes. "And your references?" "My letter from Lady Whitmore is genuine, but selective. She chose not to mention the circumstances of my departure. I suspect she was embarrassed by her husband's behaviour, and wanted the matter forgotten." "So you are guilty of deception." "I am guilty of desperation." Cordelia met his gaze without flinching. "I needed employment. No one would hire a governess who had attacked a viscount, regardless of the reason. So I accepted the reference Lady Whitmore offered and prayed no one would look too closely." The Duke was silent for a long moment. His face gave nothing away, but Cordelia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped too tightly behind his back. "Mrs. Hartley believes you are fortune-hunting, that you have targeted me as a mark, and are using my daughter to worm your way into my affections." "Mrs. Hartley believes what she wishes to believe. That is not an answer." "No." Cordelia took a breath. "The answer is that I am not fortune-hunting. I came to Thornfield because I needed a position, and I stayed because your daughter needed someone who would not leave. Everything else—" She hesitated. "Everything else is complicated." "Explain." The word was a command, sharp and uncompromising. Cordelia felt something in her chest tighten. "I cannot explain what I do, not understand myself." She moved toward him, stopping just out of arm's reach. "I know that I care for Isabel genuinely, deeply, in a way that has nothing to do with money or position. I know that I have come to regard you with something beyond professional respect." "Regard." His voice was dry. "I am trying to be honest, without being inappropriate. You told me my title would do nicely. That ship has sailed." Cordelia felt her cheeks warm. "I was making a point." "What point, exactly?" "That you see everything as a transaction. That you cannot imagine someone wanting something from you that cannot be bought." She met his eyes. "You offered me money to leave. I told you the only thing of value you possessed was something money could not buy. My title. Yourself. Your heart. The man you are beneath all the armor and walls and careful distance." She saw him flinch and pressed forward. "You have spent 6 years convincing yourself that you are nothing more than a duke, a function, a position, a collection of duties and obligations. But that is not true. I have seen you with your daughter. I have seen the way you looked at her when her fever broke. You are more than what you allow the world to see. And you think you can— what? Save me? His voice was bitter. Reform the cold, damaged Duke with your earnest declarations and your stubborn refusal to give up? I think I can see you. That is not the same thing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside the windows, twilight was gathering, painting the sky in shades of purple and grey. Mrs. Hartley wants you gone, the Duke said finally. She has made it clear that your presence in this household is disruptive. I am sure she has. She has served my family for 20 years. She knows this house, this estate, my daughter. She has been loyal and reliable and above reproach. She has also been cruel to a child who desperately needs kindness, rigid with servants who deserve respect, and suspicious of anyone who threatens her position. Cordelia lifted her chin. But I understand. She has seniority. She has history. I have neither. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he moved toward her. When Catherine died, he said quietly, I thought I would die too. Not physically, my body continued to function, to eat and sleep and perform its duties, but whatever part of me was alive, was capable of joy or connection or love. That part died with her. Cordelia held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had prompted this confession. I blamed myself. I still blame myself. I married her because it was expected, because our families had an arrangement, because I thought that duty could substitute for love. And she died, bringing my child into the world, a child I had convinced her to bear, because a duke requires an heir. Sebastian, don't. His voice cracked. Don't call me that. I don't— He stopped, his jaw working. I have spent 6 years telling myself that I deserved the punishment of isolation, that if I could not love properly, I should not love at all. I built walls around my heart because I thought they would protect me, protect everyone from the damage I cause. And have they? No. The word was barely a whisper. They have only made everything worse. I have failed my daughter, failed my household, failed everyone who has tried to reach me. I am exactly what Mrs. Hartley believes you to be, a fortune hunter of a different sort, grasping at cold comfort because I am too afraid to risk warmth. Cordelia closed the distance between them. She reached up slowly, giving him time to pull away, and laid her hand against his cheek. You are not beyond repair, she said softly. No one is beyond repair. He closed his eyes. For a moment he leaned into her touch, his face softening, his breath shuddering out of him. Then he stepped back, and the mask slammed back into place. Mrs. Hartley is dismissed. Cordelia blinked. What? I said Mrs. Hartley is dismissed. Tonight. I will arrange for a generous pension and an excellent reference. She has served this family well, and her departure should not be unnecessarily cruel. But she cannot remain here, not after this. I don't understand. Don't you? He met her eyes, and there was something new there, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. She asked me to choose between a woman who has served me loyally for 20 years and a woman who has been here less than a month. She expected me to make the practical choice, the safe choice, the choice that would preserve order and stability. And you chose— I chose you. He said it simply, as if it were not the most extraordinary thing Cordelia had ever heard. God help me, I chose you. The words hung between them, bright and terrifying. Cordelia's heart pounded in her chest. Why? Because you stayed. His voice roughened. Through the fever, through the difficult nights, through my daughter's tantrums and my cold distance, and everything this house has thrown at you, you stayed. Not because I paid you, not because you hoped for advancement, but because you gave your word to a lonely child, and you refused to break it. That is not. And because when I offered to buy your departure, you refused. You looked me in the eye and told me that my title would do nicely, and for the first time in 6 years, someone made me feel like a man instead of a function. He stepped toward her again, and this time he did not stop at arm's reach. You see me, Cordelia. I do not know how or why, but you see me. And I am terrified, and I do not deserve you. But I cannot let you walk out that door. She should be sensible. She should point out the impropriety of this conversation, the impossibility of any future between a duke and a governess, the 1,000 ways this could end in disaster. Instead, she said, "Then don't." He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, not the tentative exploration of two people testing uncertain waters. It was desperate and consuming, the kiss of a drowning man who has finally found air. His hands came up to cup her face, his fingers threading through her hair, and she melted into him as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. "This is madness," he murmured. "Complete madness," she agreed. "The scandal alone will be spectacular." He laughed, an actual laugh, rusty from disuse but real, and something in Cordelia's chest cracked open with joy. "What do we do now?" she asked. "I have no idea." He pulled back to look at her, his grey eyes warm for the first time since she had known him. "But I suspect we should start by figuring out how to tell my daughter that her governess has managed to do the impossible. Win her wager? Make me fall in love with her." The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Cordelia smiled the same smile she had given him that first morning, full of challenge and promise. "I did warn you," she said. "I never lose." The weeks that followed were the strangest of Cordelia's life. Mrs. Hartley departed Thornfield Manor within days, her face a mask of cold fury as she climbed into the carriage that would carry her away. The household watched in stunned silence, whispers spreading like wildfire through the servants' quarters. The Duke had dismissed Mrs. Hartley. The Duke had kept the governess. The Duke was, impossibly, smiling. Cordelia weathered the whispers with as much grace as she could muster. She was still Isabel's governess. That, at least, had not changed. She still taught lessons, still oversaw the child's education, still took her meals in the nursery like any proper employee. But there were differences now, subtle shifts in the architecture of her daily life. The Duke joined them for tea, not every day, but often enough that Isabel stopped looking surprised when he appeared in the nursery doorway, his presence filling the room like sunlight after rain. He listened to Isabel's recitations, praised her progress, asked questions about the books they were reading. Slowly, tentatively, father and daughter began to rebuild the bridge that had collapsed 6 years ago. And there were stolen moments, a brush of fingers in a hallway, a glance across a crowded room, the occasional evening when Cordelia would find herself summoned to the library for consultation about Isabel's education, and would leave an hour later with swollen lips and a racing heart. It was improper. It was scandalous. It was the happiest Cordelia had ever been. "Father says we're going to Lord Pemberton's ball," Isabel announced one afternoon, looking up from her geography lesson with barely concealed excitement. "He says you're coming too." Cordelia blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The ball, next Saturday. Father says we're all going, and you're to pose as a distant cousin so no one asks questions about why the governess is dancing." This was news to Cordelia, who had not been informed of any ball, any dancing, or any distant cousin deception. She was formulating a diplomatic response when the nursery door opened and the Duke himself appeared. "I see my daughter has spoiled the surprise." His voice was dry, but his eyes were warm as they met Cordelia's. "I had intended to ask you myself. Ask me to attend a ball under a false identity. Ask you to be seen with me, in public, as something more than an employee." He crossed to where she sat, his hand coming to rest on the back of her chair. "It is a risk. If anyone recognizes you, if anyone suspects the truth—" "The scandal will be spectacular," Cordelia finished. "Yes, I believe we've established that. Are you willing?" She looked up at him, this complicated, damaged, slowly healing man who had somehow become the center of her world, and smiled. "I would be honored, Your Grace." "Sebastian." He said it quietly, a gift offered across the space between them. "When we are alone, when there are no servants or strangers to hear, call me Sebastian. Sebastian." She tested the name on her tongue, felt the intimacy of it settle into her bones. "Very well. I would be honored, Sebastian." His hand brushed her shoulder, the lightest of touches, and then he was gone. Isabel watched this exchange with the sharp eyes of a child who was rapidly putting together a puzzle. "You're going to marry him, aren't you?" she said. "That's why he's bringing you to the ball. He wants everyone to see." "Nothing has been decided, but you want to, and he wants to." Isabel tilted her head, considering. "Will you still be my governess after you're a duchess?" The word hit Cordelia like a physical blow. Duchess. She had not allowed herself to think that far ahead, had not permitted herself to imagine what might happen if this impossible thing actually came to pass. "We are very far from such decisions," she said carefully. "Your father and I have known each other only a few weeks. Society expects a proper courtship, a formal engagement, all the rituals of— Father doesn't care about society. He says society is a collection of hypocrites dressed in silk. He is not wrong, but even so. And you don't care about society either. You told me that the warrior queens who changed the world didn't wait for permission." Isabel crossed her arms. "Are you a warrior queen, Miss Blackwood? Or are you a coward?" Cordelia laughed despite herself. "You are an impertinent child. I learned it from you. Fair point." She reached across the table and took Isabel's hand. The child's fingers were small and warm, trusting in a way they had not been a month ago. "Whatever happens between your father and me," Cordelia said quietly, "I will not abandon you. That was my promise, and I intend to keep it. If I become a duchess—" the word still felt strange on her tongue. "If I become a duchess, you will still be my first priority. You have my word." Isabel studied her for a long moment. Then, satisfied by whatever she saw in Cordelia's face, she nodded. "Good. Now can we finish the geography lesson? I want to know about the Nile." The ball at Pemberton House arrived with all the inevitability of a storm on the horizon. Cordelia stood before the mirror in her borrowed gown, a confection of deep blue silk, that the Duke had arranged without her knowledge, fitted by a modiste who had asked no questions and barely recognized herself. The woman in the glass was elegant, polished, the kind of woman who belonged at balls and garden parties, and all the glittering events of the ton. She bore almost no resemblance to the desperate governess who had arrived at Thornfield Manor in a worn travelling dress and mended gloves. "You look beautiful." She turned to find Sebastian in the doorway, immaculate in evening dress, his grey eyes warm as they travelled over her. "I look terrified," she corrected. "That too." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "We do not have to do this. Say the word, and we will stay home. No one will think less of you." "You will think less of me, and I will think less of myself." She squeezed his fingers. "I am not going to hide. Not from society, not from the whispers, not from anything. If we are to be together, let it be openly. You may change your mind after tonight. I may, but I doubt it. He smiled a real smile, unguarded and full of affection, and offered her his arm. Then let us give them something to whisper about. Pemberton House was ablaze with light and colour, and the overwhelming press of London society at its most extravagant. Cordelia had attended such events before, in another life, when she was still the daughter of a prosperous merchant, and the world had not yet taught her how quickly fortunes could fall. But she had never entered a ballroom on the arm of a duke, never felt the weight of 100 curious stares, never experienced the peculiar combination of terror and exhilaration that came with being the centre of attention. The Duke guided her through the crowd with practised ease, his hand steady on her arm, his face the impassive mask he wore in public. But she could feel the tension in his muscles, could see the way his jaw tightened when a matron whispered behind her fan. "His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield," the footman announced, "and Miss Cordelia Ashworth." Ashworth, not Blackwood. The false name had been Sebastian's idea, a distant cousin, he would explain to anyone who asked, visiting from the northern branch of the family. It was close enough to truth to be believable, far enough from it to provide protection. Thornfield. By God, I never thought to see you at one of these things. A florid gentleman in an unfortunate waistcoat approached them, his voice booming across the crowd. "And with a lady on your arm, no less. Is this the mysterious cousin I've been hearing about?" "Lord Pemberton." Sebastian's voice was cool but polite. "May I present Miss Cordelia Ashworth? She is visiting from Yorkshire." "Yorkshire? Bit of a journey for a ball, what?" Lord Pemberton's eyes travelled over Cordelia with open curiosity. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Ashworth. Any relation to the Ashworths of Harrogate? Distantly, I believe." Cordelia smiled her most charming smile, the one she had perfected in years of navigating difficult social situations. "It is a pleasure to meet you as well, Lord Pemberton. Your home is lovely." Yes, the wife's doing, all of it." He waved a dismissive hand. "Now then, Thornfield, you must tell me what's brought you out of that draughty old pile. Last I heard, you'd sworn off society entirely." "Circumstances change." "Evidently." Pemberton's eyes flickered between Sebastian and Cordelia, sharp with speculation. "Well, don't let me keep you. The dancing will start shortly, and I suspect you'll want to claim a set with your lovely cousin before the young bucks descend." He moved away, already hailing another acquaintance, and Cordelia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That went well," Sebastian murmured. "That went adequately. The real test is yet to come." She was right. Over the next hour they were approached by a parade of curious aristocrats, each more pointed in their questions than the last. Who was Miss Ashworth? Where precisely in Yorkshire did she reside? How had she come to be visiting Thornfield? Why had she never been seen in society before? Cordelia answered each inquiry with practised ease, her responses vague enough to be true, specific enough to be believable. She had spent years learning to navigate the treacherous waters of high society, and those skills had not deserted her. But the whispers followed them everywhere. "Did you hear? Thornfield has actually brought a woman, a cousin, supposedly, though I've never heard of any Ashworths in Yorkshire. She's beautiful enough, I suppose, but there's something odd about her, something not quite right. I heard she arrived at Thornfield a month ago, as a governess." The last whisper cut through the murmur of conversation like a knife through silk. Cordelia felt Sebastian stiffen beside her. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "I am trying. They are vultures, feeding on the bones of other people's lives. They do not matter." But they did matter, and they both knew it. If word spread that the Duke of Thornfield was courting his daughter's governess, the scandal would be catastrophic. Cordelia's reputation would be destroyed. Sebastian's would be tarnished. Isabel would be tainted by association, whispered about as the product of an eccentric household. Her marriage prospects diminished before she was old enough to know what marriage meant. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Sebastian turned to her. "Dance with me." "Is that wise?" "Probably not. Dance with me anyway." She placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor. Dancing with Sebastian was nothing like dancing with the young men who had partnered her in her previous life. They had been nervous, uncertain, focused on the steps. Sebastian moved with the confidence of a man who had learned to waltz as a child and had never forgotten, his hand warm at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're staring," she murmured. "I am attempting to memorize this moment." "Why?" "Because you are magnificent." He spun her through a turn, their bodies moving in perfect synchrony. "Because you walked into a ballroom full of people who would destroy you given half a chance, and you smiled at them as if they were beneath your notice. Because you are braver than anyone I have ever known, and I do not deserve you." "You keep saying that. It keeps being true." She wanted to argue, to tell him that he was wrong, that she was not brave so much as desperate, not magnificent so much as good at pretending. But the music swelled around them, and his hand tightened at her waist, and she let herself believe, just for a moment, that she was exactly what he saw. When the dance ended, they stood on the edge of the floor, breathing hard, their eyes locked. "Cordelia." "Miss Blackwood. How delightful to see you again." The voice was familiar, horribly, catastrophically familiar. Cordelia turned, and her blood ran cold. Lord Whitmore stood behind them, a glass of champagne in one hand, a smile of pure malice on his handsome face. He was older than she remembered, his golden hair threaded with grey, his once athletic figure softening around the middle, but his eyes were the same cold and calculating, the eyes of a predator who had cornered his prey. "I'm sorry," Sebastian said, his voice carefully neutral. "Have we met?" "Forgive me, Your Grace. I am Lord Whitmore, and I believe I am already acquainted with your companion, though she was not calling herself Ashworth the last time we met." His smile widened. "Miss Blackwood, isn't it? The governess? I must say you've done quite well for yourself since our last encounter." The world narrowed to a single point. Whitmore's satisfied face, Sebastian's rigid posture, the murmur of voices around them as nearby guests caught the scent of scandal. "I think you are mistaken, my lord," Cordelia said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "We have never met." "Oh, but we have. At my home in Sussex, not 8 months ago. You were governess to my son, if I recall correctly, until you attacked me with a vase and fled in the night like a common criminal." The whispers erupted, heads turned, fans fluttered. The nightmare that Cordelia had been dreading since she first entered Thornfield Manor had finally, inevitably arrived. "That is a lie." Sebastian's voice cut through the murmur, cold and sharp as a blade. "And I suggest you retract it immediately. I assure you, Your Grace, it is the truth. Ask anyone in my household. Miss Blackwood is a violent, unstable woman who should be nowhere near polite society and certainly nowhere near a man of your standing." Whitmore's eyes glittered with triumph. "I would hate for your reputation to be damaged by association with such a creature." Sebastian took a step forward. His face was the cold mask Cordelia had seen when they first met. But there was something different behind it now. Not distance, but fury, barely contained. "You will not speak of her that way." "Your Grace." "I know what you are, Whitmore. I know what you tried to do to her in your library." Sebastian's voice dropped to a register that made the nearby guests step back instinctively. "I know you are a man who preys upon women who have no power to refuse him, and I know that if you ever come near her again, if you ever so much as speak her name in my presence, I will destroy you." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed upon them, every breath held in anticipation of what would come next. Whitmore's face had gone pale. "You cannot—" "I can, and I will." Sebastian stepped forward again, and this time Whitmore flinched backward. "You have made a grave error in judgment, my lord. You assumed that because she is a woman without fortune or family, she is without protection. You were wrong. She has me, and I will spend every resource at my disposal ensuring that you regret this moment for the rest of your miserable life." He turned, offering Cordelia his arm with all the formality of a prince addressing a queen. "Shall we, Miss Blackwood?" She took his arm. Her legs were shaking, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with the impossibility of what had just occurred. But she held her head high as they walked through the parted crowd, past the staring faces and the whispered speculations, out into the cool night air. The carriage ride home was silent. Sebastian sat across from her, his face unreadable, his hands clenched in his lap. Cordelia watched him through the darkness, trying to find words for what had happened. "You should not have done that," she said finally. "I should have done more. The scandal will be significant, yes." He met her eyes. "I do not care. You must care. Your daughter, my daughter would tell me that Boudica did not care what the Romans thought, and neither should we." He reached across the space between them and took her hands. "Cordelia, I have spent 6 years caring what society thought. I have built my life around appearances and expectations and the judgment of people who matter nothing to me. And I am done. Sebastian, I love you." The words fell between them, simple and devastating. "I love you, and I will not hide it. Not from Whitmore, not from society, not from anyone. If they cannot accept that the Duke of Thornfield has chosen a governess, then they can go to the devil. It's not that simple." "No, it isn't." He raised her hands to his lips. "But I am done being simple. I am done being safe. I am done pretending that the walls I build protect me when all they do is trap me in my own loneliness." Cordelia felt tears prick at her eyes. "You might regret this." "I might, but I will regret losing you far more." He pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Marry me, Cordelia. Not as a transaction, not as an arrangement, but as a choice. My choice. Yours." She stared at him through the darkness of the carriage, this impossible man who had started as her employer and become her world. "I am a governess," she said, "a merchant's daughter, a woman who threw a vase at a viscount." "You are magnificent." His voice was rough. "And you are mine, if you will have me." The carriage rattled through the night. The city lights flickered past the windows, and Cordelia, who had learned long ago that love was a luxury for those who could afford it, discovered that she had been wrong. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will have you." He kissed her, then not the desperate kiss of the library, but something softer, more certain, a promise sealed in the darkness between one life and the next. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. "The scandal will be spectacular," she murmured. "Let it." His hands cradled her face like something precious. "Let them all see. I am tired of hiding." She smiled against his lips. "Then let's give them something to talk about." The carriage deposited them at Thornfield Manor well past midnight. The servants had retired, the house dark and silent, but candles still burned in the nursery windows. "Isabel is awake," Cordelia said, surprised. "She insisted on waiting up." Sebastian helped her down from the carriage, his hand warm in hers. "She wanted to hear about the ball." They found the child curled in a chair by the fire, a book open on her lap, her eyes drooping. She jerked awake as they entered, her face lighting with curiosity. "You're back! How was it? Did you dance? Did anyone try to expose you? Father, why do you look like you've been in a fight?" Sebastian crossed to his daughter and knelt before her, taking her small hands in his large ones. "The ball was eventful," he said. "I danced with Miss Blackwood. Someone did, in fact, try to expose her." Isabel's eyes widened. "What happened?" "I told him that if he ever came near her again, I would destroy him." "Father!" The child's voice was delighted. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever done." "I thought so too." Sebastian glanced at Cordelia, his eyes warm. "And then I asked Miss Blackwood to marry me." The silence that followed was absolute. Isabel's gaze swung between them, her expression shifting from shock to hope to something very close to joy. "You did? And she said yes? She's going to be my mother?" The words tumbled out in a rush. "I mean, not my real mother, but like a mother. Someone who stays?" Cordelia moved to kneel beside Sebastian, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "I will not try to replace your mother," she said gently. "No one can replace her, but I will love you and care for you and stay with you for as long as you will have me. That is a different thing, but it can be just as real." Isabel stared at her for a long moment. Then, with the sudden fierceness of a child who has finally allowed herself to hope, she launched herself into Cordelia's arms. "Promise," she whispered against Cordelia's shoulder. "Promise you won't leave." "I promise." Cordelia held her tight, feeling Sebastian's hand come to rest on her back. The three of them bound together in the firelight. "I promise. I promise. I promise." Later, after Isabel had been coaxed into bed and the house had settled into silence, Cordelia found herself alone with Sebastian in the library. A fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls. She stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens, trying to process everything that had happened. "Having second thoughts?" She turned to find him watching her from across the room, his cravat loosened, his jacket discarded, looking more human than she had ever seen him. "Constant second thoughts," she admitted, "and third thoughts, and fourth. This is madness, Sebastian. The scandal tonight was only the beginning. By tomorrow, all of London will know that the Duke of Thornfield proposed to his governess in the middle of a ball. Your reputation will survive, or it won't." He crossed to her, stopping just close enough to touch, but not touching yet. "I told you once that I have spent 6 years hiding behind walls I built to protect myself. Tonight, I chose to tear them down. For me, for us, for Isabel, for the man I want to become, instead of the man I've been." He reached out, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "You asked me once what happened to the 7 governesses before you. Do you want to know the truth? I thought I knew the truth. Isabel drove them away. Isabel played a part, but so did I." His voice was quiet, honest. "I hired women who would not challenge me, women who would do their jobs and leave me alone. When they got too close, when they asked too many questions, I made it clear they were not welcome. Mrs. Hartley took care of the rest." "You pushed them away on purpose." "I pushed everyone away on purpose. It was safer that way, lonelier but safer." His hand cupped her face. "And then you arrived, with your copper hair and your stubborn spine and your absolute refusal to be pushed anywhere. And I didn't stand a chance." Cordelia leaned into his touch. "I should have left. After the fever. After Mrs. Hartley, there were a dozen moments when a sensible woman would have walked away. Why didn't you?" "Because Isabel needed me." She covered his hand with her own. And because I think I knew, even then, that you needed me too, even if you couldn't admit it. I need you now. He leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. I will need you tomorrow, and next week, and next year, and for the rest of my life, if you will have me. I already said yes. Tell me again. She smiled, pulling back enough to meet his eyes. Yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife, your partner, your challenger, your comfort. I will stay when things are hard, and fight when things are unfair, and love you even when you retreat behind your walls, because I know now how to climb them. She pressed a kiss to his palm. I will give you everything I have, Sebastian Ashworth, not because you bought me, but because I choose you, because I love you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, the fire had burned down to embers, and the moon had climbed high over the gardens. The scandal will be spectacular, she murmured. Let it, he said. We have survived worse. And standing there in the darkness with his arms around her, Cordelia found that she believed him. The scandal was indeed spectacular. Within 3 days of the Pemberton ball, every drawing-room in London hummed with the news. The Duke of Thornfield, cold, distant, untouchable Thornfield, had proposed to his daughter's governess. Not only proposed, but defended her honour against Lord Whitmore in full view of half the ton. The story grew with each retelling. Some said he had challenged Whitmore to a duel, others that he had struck the Viscount across the face, still others that the mysterious Miss Blackwood had thrown a vase at Whitmore's head right there in the ballroom. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complicated. Cordelia weathered the storm from behind the walls of Thornfield Manor, where Sebastian had insisted she remain until the worst of the gossip subsided. She spent her days with Isabel, maintaining their lessons with a determination that bordered on defiance. If society wanted to whisper about the governess who had trapped a duke, let them. She would not hide, and she would not apologize. But the whispers found their way inside nonetheless. Lady Ashworth has called again, the new housekeeper reported one afternoon, her face carefully neutral. Mrs. Davies was a sensible woman in her 50s, hired on Sebastian's recommendation to replace the departed Mrs. Hartley. She was efficient, discreet, and utterly uninterested in household drama. She requests an audience with Miss Blackwood. Cordelia looked up from the letter she was writing, a carefully worded response to yet another inquiry from a gossip columnist. Lady Ashworth? The Dowager Duchess, His Grace's mother. Of course. In all the chaos of the past weeks, Cordelia had nearly forgotten that Sebastian had a mother, a formidable woman, by all accounts, who had retreated to the family's country estate after her son's wife died and had not returned to London since. Did she say what she wanted? Only that she wishes to meet the woman who has turned her son's life upside down. Mrs. Davies's lips twitched. Her exact words, miss. Cordelia set down her pen. She had known this moment. Would come eventually the reckoning with Sebastian's family, the judgment of those who had known him longest. She had simply hoped for more time to prepare. Tell her I will receive her in the drawing-room, and please inform His Grace that his mother has arrived. His Grace is already aware. He is preparing himself. The hesitation spoke volumes. Sebastian's relationship with his mother was complicated at best, strained at worst. He had mentioned her rarely, and always with a careful neutrality that suggested deep wells of feeling beneath the surface. Cordelia smoothed her dress, one of the new gowns Sebastian had insisted on ordering, a deep green silk that made her feel almost like she belonged in this world, and made her way to the drawing-room. The Dowager Duchess of Thornfield was everything Cordelia had expected, and nothing like she had imagined. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair swept back from a face that must have been beautiful in youth and remained striking in age. Her grey eyes, Sebastian's eyes, swept over Cordelia with an assessment that missed nothing. "So," she said, "you are the governess." "I am." Cordelia curtsied, keeping her movements graceful despite her nerves. "It is an honor to meet you, Your Grace." "Is it?" The Dowager's voice was cool. "I rather think it is an ordeal you would have preferred to avoid. Sit down, Miss Blackwood. We have much to discuss." Cordelia sat, folding her hands in her lap, with a composure she did not feel. The Dowager remained standing, examining her as one might examine a horse before purchase. "You are pretty enough, I suppose. Not a great beauty, but pleasant. Your posture is good, your manners acceptable. You speak well, which suggests education above your station." The assessment continued, clinical and thorough. "How old are you?" 26, Your Grace. Old for a governess, young for a duchess." The Dowager finally moved, settling into a chair across from Cordelia, with the easy grace of a woman who had never doubted her place in the world. "Do you know what they are saying about you in London?" "I can imagine. Fortune hunter, schemer, seductress who bewitched a grieving widower." The words were delivered without inflection, but Cordelia flinched nonetheless. "They say you manipulated your way into his bed, and are now forcing him into marriage to avoid scandal. That is not true. I am aware." The Dowager's eyes softened just slightly. "My son has written to me, twice in fact, which is more correspondence than I have received from him in the past 6 years combined. He tells me that you are brilliant, brave, and entirely unsuitable for his position, and that he intends to marry you regardless of anyone's objections, including mine." "He said that?" "He said considerably more than that, but I will spare you the details." For the first time, something that might have been a smile flickered across the Dowager's face. "He also said that you saved his daughter's life, that you stayed when everyone else left, that you see him as he truly is, rather than as the world expects him to be." Cordelia's throat tightened. "I only did what anyone would do." "No, Miss Blackwood. You did what no one else has managed to do in 6 years. The Dowager leaned forward, her grey eyes intent. "My son died when his wife died. Not physically his body continued to function, but the man I raised, the man who used to laugh and love and feel, that man disappeared. I watched it happen, and I could do nothing to stop it. I tried, God knows I tried, but he had built walls so high that even his mother could not reach him. Your Grace. And then you arrived." The Dowager's voice softened. "A merchant's daughter, a governess, a woman with no fortune, no connections, nothing to recommend her except her own stubborn heart, and somehow, impossibly, you found a way inside those walls." Cordelia felt tears prick at her eyes. "I love him." "Yes, I rather think you do." The Dowager rose, crossing to stand before Cordelia. "I came here today prepared to despise you, to find evidence of scheming or manipulation, to prove that my son was being taken advantage of by a clever opportunist. I wanted to protect him, as I have always tried to protect him, even when he made it impossible. And now? Now I find that my son does not need protection from you. He needs protection by you." The Dowager extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation Cordelia took it. "Welcome to the family, Miss Blackwood. God knows we need someone with your spine." The drawing-room door opened and Sebastian appeared. His face was guarded, braced for conflict, but his expression shifted when he saw his mother holding Cordelia's hand. "Mother!" "Sebastian." The Dowager released Cordelia and turned to her son. "You look terrible. Have you been sleeping?" "I have been managing a scandal." "Yes, I noticed. The vase-throwing was a nice touch, very dramatic. She moved toward him, her tall frame suddenly seeming smaller, more vulnerable. "I came to meet your intended. I find her adequate." Sebastian's lips twitched. "High praise." "It is the highest praise I am capable of on short acquaintance. Give me time." She reached up and touched his face, a gesture so tender that Cordelia felt like an intruder. "You look happy, Sebastian. Tired and embattled and probably in need of a good solicitor, but happy. I had forgotten what that looked like on you. Mother, do not apologize, do not explain. Just be happy." She stepped back, composing herself. "I will return for the wedding. I expect a proper ceremony, none of this rushed elopement nonsense. The family chapel, fresh flowers, your grandmother's veil for the bride. If we are going to scandalize society, we shall do it with impeccable taste." She swept out of the room before either of them could respond, leaving silence in her wake. Sebastian turned to Cordelia, his expression somewhere between stunned and amused. "That went better than expected," he said. "Your mother called me adequate. From her, that is practically a declaration of love." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Are you all right?" "I think so." She looked up at him, marveling at how much had changed in so short a time. "She said you wrote to her. Twice. I may have been effusive." "You? Effusive?" "It has been known to happen. On rare occasions. Under extreme provocation." He pulled her into his arms, his chin resting on the top of her head. "My mother is a formidable woman. I was not certain she would accept you. She has not entirely accepted me. She has merely decided not to oppose me. For my mother, that is acceptance." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "The wedding preparations will begin immediately." She was not joking about the family chapel and the grandmother's veil. When the Dowager Duchess of Thornfield declares that something will happen, it happens. Cordelia laughed despite herself. "I am beginning to understand where you get your stubbornness. It is a family trait. Isabel has inherited it as well. You may have noticed." "I may have." They stood together in the drawing-room, wrapped in each other's arms, while the afternoon light slanted through the windows and the world outside continued to whisper and speculate and judge. It did not matter. None of it mattered. They had each other. They had Isabel. They had a future that neither of them had dared to imagine. And that was enough. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. The wedding was set for early December, less than 2 months away, scandalously fast by society's standards, but Sebastian refused to wait any longer. "I have wasted 6 years of my life," he told Cordelia one evening, as they reviewed invitation lists by firelight. "I will not waste another day." The guest list was small but carefully chosen. Sebastian's mother took charge of the arrangements with military precision, descending upon Thornfield Manor with an army of servants and a determination to make the wedding an event that society will discuss for decades in the proper way this time. Cordelia found herself fitted for a wedding dress, tutored in the intricacies of ducal protocol, and introduced to a bewildering array of distant Ashworth relatives who emerged from the countryside like rabbits from a hedgerow. Most were polite, if reserved. A few were openly hostile, making pointed comments about fortune hunters and social climbers. One elderly aunt declared that the family was doomed and retreated to her room for the duration. Through it all, Isabel remained Cordelia's constant companion and fiercest defender. "Lady Ashworth said you were common," the child reported one afternoon, her blue eyes blazing with indignation. "I told her that common was better than cruel, and that father was going to marry you regardless of what anyone thought, and that if she didn't like it, she could go back to whatever musty old estate she crawled out of." "Isabel?" Cordelia tried to sound stern, but laughter threatened to escape. You cannot speak to Lady Ashworth that way. She is your father's cousin. She is a horrible old bat who smells like lavender and disapproval. Isabel crossed her arms. And I don't care if she is the Queen herself. No one speaks ill of you in my presence. Your loyalty is admirable if misdirected. It is not misdirected. You are going to be my mother. The word came out fierce and defiant, as if Isabel were daring the world to contradict her. That means I am allowed to defend you. Cordelia felt her heart crack open. She pulled the child into her arms, holding her tight. You wonderful, impossible girl, she murmured. What did I do to deserve you? You stayed. Isabel's voice was muffled against Cordelia's shoulder. That's all. You just stayed. But not everyone was pleased with the impending nuptials. Lord Whitmore, humiliated at the Pemberton ball and furious at Sebastian's public denunciation, had not gone quietly into the night. Instead, he had launched a campaign of whispered poison, spreading rumours and insinuations throughout London society. The governess was a fallen woman. She had seduced other employers before. She was carrying Sebastian's child, and the marriage was merely a cover-up for scandal. None of it was true, but truth had never been Whitmore's concern. Sebastian dealt with each rumour as it arose, using his considerable influence to suppress the worst of them. But he could not suppress everything, and the strain was beginning to show. He slept poorly, ate less, and spent long hours in his study dealing with correspondence that he refused to share with Cordelia. "You're protecting me again," she said one evening, finding him at his desk long after midnight, his face haggard in the candlelight. "I thought we agreed no more walls. This is not a wall. This is management." "Sebastian." She crossed to his desk, planting her hands on the polished wood. "Tell me what is happening." He looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes tired and troubled. Then he handed her the letter he had been reading. It was from Whitmore. The contents made Cordelia's blood run cold. "Your Grace, I understand you intend to marry the woman who assaulted me. I feel it is my duty to inform you that I have in my possession certain documents regarding Miss Blackwood's father, documents that prove his bankruptcy was not the result of a partner's betrayal, as she claims, but of his own deliberate fraud. If this information were to become public, the shame would not only destroy Miss Blackwood's reputation, but would cast serious doubt on any children of your union. The taint of criminal blood, as I'm sure you understand, is not easily overcome. I propose a simple solution. Pay me £50,000 and the documents will be destroyed. Refuse, and they will be published in every newspaper in London. Your servant, Lord Whitmore." Cordelia read the letter twice, her hands trembling. Then she looked up at Sebastian. "He's lying. My father was not a criminal. He was deceived by his partner. Everyone knew that. There was an investigation, and he was cleared of any wrongdoing." "I know." Sebastian's voice was gentle. "I had my solicitors look into your father's affairs weeks ago, when Mrs. Hartley first raised questions about your background. Your father was a victim, not a perpetrator. There are no documents because there is nothing to document." "Then Whitmore is bluffing." "Yes, but a bluff can still cause damage if enough people believe it." Sebastian rose from his desk, moving to stand before her. "I can pay him. £50,000 is nothing to me. It would make this problem disappear." "No." The word came out sharp, certain. "If you pay him once, he will come back again and again. Men like Whitmore are never satisfied. They see weakness and exploit it." "Then what do you suggest?" Cordelia looked at the letter in her hands. This piece of paper that represented everything she had feared since the moment she first entered Thornfield Manor. The past she could not escape. The shame she had tried so hard to outrun. The vulnerability of being a woman without power in a world that belonged to men. And then, slowly, an idea began to form. "You said you would destroy him," she said, "at the ball. You said if he ever came near me again, you would use every resource at your disposal." "I meant it." "Then let's do it properly." She set the letter down on his desk, her jaw set with determination. "Whitmore has made himself vulnerable by putting his threat in writing. That letter is evidence of extortion, a criminal offense. If we take it to the right people, if we make it public in the right way, he will be the one facing ruin, not us." Sebastian studied her for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. "You are terrifying," he said. "Have I mentioned that?" "Frequently. Usually when I am right." "You are always right." He took her hands in his. "Are you certain about this? Going to war with Whitmore will be ugly. He has powerful friends, and he will not hesitate to use every weapon at his disposal." "He has already used every weapon at his disposal. He has called me a fortune hunter, a seductress, and now a criminal's daughter. What more can he do?" Cordelia lifted her chin. "I am done being afraid of men like him. I am done letting them dictate the terms of my life. If he wants a war, I will give him one." Sebastian's smile widened, and something fierce and proud blazed in his grey eyes. "Then war it is," he said. "Together." The following weeks saw the destruction of Lord Whitmore. Sebastian moved with the cold efficiency of a man who had been waiting years for a worthy target. His solicitors produced evidence of Whitmore's extortion attempt, his history of predatory behavior towards servants and employees, his mounting debts and desperate attempts to cover them. The information was shared, quietly at first and then loudly, with the right people at the right times. Whitmore's friends abandoned him. His creditors descended. His wife, who had long tolerated his indiscretions in exchange for the comfort of his title, finally reached her limit and began proceedings for legal separation. By the time the wedding arrived, Lord Whitmore had fled London entirely, retreating to a crumbling estate in the North Country with nothing but his debts and his ruined reputation for company. Cordelia felt no triumph in his downfall, only relief and a grim satisfaction that justice for once had prevailed. The wedding took place on a cold December morning, the kind of day when frost painted the windows and breath hung visible in the air. The family chapel at Thornfield was small but beautiful, decorated with winter roses and evergreen boughs. The guests were few. Sebastian's mother, a handful of relatives who had proven worthy of inclusion, and the household servants who had become, over the months, something very close to family. Isabel served as attendant, her small face solemn with the weight of responsibility. She wore a dress of pale blue silk and carried a basket of flower petals that she scattered with methodical precision, ensuring perfect coverage of the aisle. And then Cordelia entered, and Sebastian forgot how to breathe. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple in design, but exquisite in execution. The dowager's grandmother's veil, a confection of antique lace, framed her face like a cloud. Her copper hair was swept up and threaded with winter flowers, and her brown eyes, meeting his across the length of the chapel, were bright with joy and tears. She was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and responses, of rings exchanged and blessings given. Sebastian heard himself speaking words he had spoken once before, to another woman in another life, but this time they felt different. This time they felt true. "I, Sebastian Edward Ashworth, take thee, Cordelia Anne Blackwood, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." And Cordelia, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, "I, Cordelia Ann Blackwood, take thee, Sebastian Edward Ashworth, to be my wedded husband." When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian kissed her with all the tenderness and desperation of a man who had been lost and was finally, impossibly, found. The wedding breakfast that followed was small and intimate, filled with laughter and champagne and the kind of joy that comes from battles hard won and futures secured. Isabel delivered a toast that made everyone cry, declaring that she had finally gotten a mother who understood that frogs were interesting, and Latin was useful, and love was not a luxury, but a necessity. "You have raised a remarkable child," the dowager murmured to Cordelia, watching Isabel hold forth on the proper care and feeding of toads to a captive audience of elderly relatives. "Though I suspect she was remarkable before you arrived." She was. She simply needed someone to see it. "And my son?" The dowager's grey eyes were piercing. "What did he need?" Cordelia considered the question. Across the room, Sebastian was laughing at something Isabel had said, his face open and unguarded in a way she had never seen in public before. "He needed permission," she said finally. "Permission to stop punishing himself. Permission to be happy again. And you gave him that." "I tried. The rest he did himself." The dowager nodded slowly. Then, with a gesture that seemed to cost her considerable effort, she reached out and squeezed Cordelia's hand. "Welcome to the family," she said. "Properly this time. As my daughter, not merely as my son's intended. Thank you, Your Grace. Eleanor." The dowager's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "If we are to be family, you must call me Eleanor." That night, alone at last in the ducal chambers, Cordelia and Sebastian stood before the fire and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. "A month ago," Cordelia said, "I was a governess. I owned 3 dresses and a pair of worn boots. My greatest ambition was to survive long enough to find another position when you inevitably dismissed me. A month ago, I was determined to never feel anything again." Sebastian drew her into his arms, his chin resting on her head. "I had convinced myself that isolation was safety, that keeping everyone at a distance would protect me from pain. And now? Now I have a wife who throws vases at viscounts and teaches my daughter about warrior queens. I have a family that actually speaks to each other. I have a future that I look forward to rather than dread." He pulled back to look at her, his grey eyes soft. "You have ruined me, Cordelia Ashworth. I will never be cold and distant again." "What a tragedy!" She rose on her toes to kiss him. "Whatever will society think? I find I do not care." He deepened the kiss, his hands sliding into her hair, pulling loose the pins that held it up. "Let them think whatever they wish. I have everything I need." They did not speak again for a long while. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Society was slow to accept the merchant's daughter who had somehow become a duchess. There were snubs at parties, whispered comments at the opera, invitations pointedly not extended. Cordelia weathered them all with the same stubborn grace that had carried her through her years as a governess, refusing to be diminished by the judgment of people who did not matter. And slowly, gradually, attitudes began to shift. It helped that the Duke of Thornfield was happier than anyone had ever seen him, laughing at dinner parties, dancing with his wife at balls, doting openly on his daughter in a way that would once have been considered embarrassing. It helped that the Duchess herself was charming, intelligent, and entirely unintimidated by rank or reputation. It helped that Isabel, growing into a beautiful and confident young woman, made it clear that anyone who slighted her mother would face her considerable wrath. But mostly, it helped that time passed, and memories faded, and scandals gave way to newer, more interesting scandals. By the time Isabel made her debut, the story of the governess who had married a duke was more legend than scandal, a romantic tale told at parties, embellished with each retelling until it barely resembled the truth. "They say father fought a duel for you," Isabel reported one evening, adjusting her gloves before her first ball. "3 duels, actually, and that you tamed him from a wild beast with nothing but your courage and your beauty." "The gossips exaggerate." Cordelia smoothed a stray curl back from her daughter's face. "Your father was never a wild beast. He was simply lost. And you found him." "We found each other." She kissed Isabel's forehead. "Now go, dance with handsome young men, break hearts. Do not accept any proposals until you have known the gentleman for at least a month, and do not let anyone make you feel less than you are." "Yes, mother." Isabel grinned, the mischievous light in her blue eyes unchanged from the difficult child who had tried to set her governess's hair on fire. "I love you." "I love you too, impossible girl. Now go be magnificent." 10 years after the wedding, Cordelia stood on the terrace at Thornfield Manor and watched chaos unfold across the lawn. The gardens that had once been so carefully manicured were now a battleground. Edward, the eldest son at 8 years old, was leading a cavalry charge on his pony, pursued by his sister Helena, who at 6 had already developed a formidable throwing arm and was pelting him with crab apples. Behind them, the youngest 4-year-old Thomas waddled determinedly in their wake, determined not to be left out of whatever mayhem his siblings had devised. And there, in the middle of it all, was Sebastian, older now, his black hair more silver than not, but laughing with an abandon that made him look 20 years younger. He caught Thomas just as the boy was about to tumble into the ornamental pond, swinging him high into the air while the child shrieked with delight. "Your husband is going to throw his back out," observed Eleanor, the Dowager Duchess, from her chair beside Cordelia. She had moved to Thornfield permanently 3 years ago, declaring that her grandchildren needed proper supervision and that Sebastian was clearly incapable of providing it. "He throws his back out at least once a month. It has never stopped him yet. Ashworth stubbornness. It runs in the family." "So I have noticed." They watched in companionable silence as Sebastian deposited Thomas safely on the grass and then allowed himself to be tackled by all 3 children at once. The resulting pile of flailing limbs and joyful screaming would have been undignified for any duke, let alone one of Sebastian's rank and reputation. He didn't seem to care. "I never thought I would see him like this," Eleanor said quietly. "After Catherine died, I thought I had lost my son forever. Not to death, but to something almost worse. Living death. A heart that beat without feeling. He was wounded. Wounded people need time to heal. He needed more than time. He needed you." Eleanor's hand found Cordelia's and squeezed. "Thank you, daughter, for giving me back my son, for giving these children their father, for all of it." Cordelia's throat tightened. Even after all these years, the Dowager's approval could still move her to tears. "I only loved him," she said. "The rest he did himself. You underestimate your contribution. You always have." Eleanor rose, brushing down her skirts. "I am going to rescue Thomas before his siblings smother him. Try not to let the house burn down while I'm gone." She descended the terrace steps with the regal grace that a decade of grandchildren had done nothing to diminish, and within moments she was in the thick of the chaos, her imperious voice cutting through the shrieks and laughter. Sebastian extracted himself from the pile of children and made his way up to the terrace, grass stains on his knees, his cravat hopelessly askew, a grin on his face that made him look like the boy he must have been, long before grief and guilt had hardened him. "You're staring," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I am admiring my husband. There is a difference. A semantic one. Perhaps." She reached over and straightened his cravat. though they both knew it was a lost cause. "You're happy." Deliriously, absurdly, embarrassingly. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "It's your fault, you know. You ruined me for cold misery forever." "A tragic loss, I'm sure." "Devastating." He tugged her out of her chair and into his lap, ignoring her protests about dignity and the servants. "Do you remember what you said to me, that first morning after Isabel's fever broke?" "I said many things. You'll have to be more specific." "I asked you to name your price to leave, and you said, 'Your title will do nicely.'" Cordelia smiled at the memory. "You looked so shocked. I thought you might actually faint. I thought you had lost your mind. A governess demanding a duke's title. It was absurd, impossible, completely mad. And yet here we are." "Here we are." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist. "You know, I never actually gave you my title. I believe the wedding ceremony covered that. Technically, yes, but I never formally presented it. Named you as my successor. Made you the Duchess of Thornfield in your own right, not merely as my wife." Cordelia's brow furrowed. "Is that even possible?" "Probably not. But I have solicitors for a reason." His grey eyes were warm, soft, filled with a love that still took her breath away after all these years. "If I could give you anything, anything in the world, what would you want?" She looked at him, this complicated, beloved man who had started as her employer and become her everything. She looked at their children tumbling across the lawn, at Eleanor marshalling them with affectionate sternness, at Thornfield Manor rising behind them like a promise kept. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the desperation, the fear, the moment when she had decided to stay, even when leaving would have been so much easier. She thought of Isabel, who was even now somewhere in the house preparing for her own wedding next month, radiant with the joy of a love that had been given time to grow. She thought of Sebastian, cold and closed when she first met him, warm and open now, a man transformed by the simple, radical act of being loved. "I already have it," she said. "I have you. I have our children. I have a family that loves me and a home where I belong. What more could I possibly want?" "Nothing?" "Well," she pretended to consider. "I suppose if you were offering I wouldn't mind another pony for Thomas. He's been coveting Edward's." Sebastian laughed, a real laugh, full and free, and pulled her into a kiss. On the lawn below, Edward shrieked as Helena landed a particularly well-aimed crab-apple. Thomas toddled after a butterfly. Eleanor's imperious voice floated up, demanding that someone fetch a towel before the Ashworth heir caught his death of cold. And on the terrace, wrapped in her husband's arms, Cordelia Ashworth, governess, duchess, wife, mother, warrior queen, smiled against his lips, and knew that she was, at last, exactly where she was meant to be. The scandal, after all, had been worth every whisper.